People say that if you do, you will be cursed. Your soul will be consumed by ghosts. But one time someone did not listen. This person went in anyway. That year the harvest was especially bad. It wasn't quite bad enough to cause starvation, but one house suffered greatly. The breadwinner had just died, leaving behind a child and its mother. No one had enough extra resources to help them, and the child was constantly hungry. One day the child went into the forbidden forest. They thought maybe there was something to eat there. In fact, they came back with all kinds of nuts and berries. The child showed their mother, smiling. They told her there was lots to eat inside. She tried to stop the child from saying more, but it was too late. The village chief called for them and reminded them to stay out of the woods. After that, they had no choice but to stay away from the forest. After all, otherwise they would have been ostracized by the entire village. It did not matter how much food was inside, they simply had to give it up. But then something very strange happened. That night, some people saw a flickering light floating near the house of the mother and her child. Then, the next morning, the woman and her child had collapsed. The villagers, fearful of the curse, would not go near them, and before long they died. The child went first. Before the mother died, she said, "Listen, I have something wonderful to tell you." She smiled as she said it. She attempted to tell them whatever it was, and then she died. Even today, no one in my village knows what she wanted to say, but everyone stays away from those woods. Most people avoid the forest, but sometimes someone decides to go in anyway. When they do, a small dancing flame visits their house that night and steals their soul. I understand, Maomao thought. She listened to this rather common story as if it all made perfect sense to her. She didn't think the story was particularly scary, but everyone else was shivering as they listened. The atmosphere in the room probably caused that reaction. It was designed to do so. She finally swallowed the dried squid, which had become nice and soft. Another piece was quickly offered to her. "You look awfully calm," Shisui whispered to her. Like Maomao, she showed no sign of having been unsettled by the story. "I guess. Why, I'll tell you later." Revealing the secret behind the story here and now would only spoil things. But often, such stories contained a kernel of truth. Maomao listened as the tales rolled on. Yinghua continued to grip her hand tightly, grabbing onto her anytime anything remotely frightening came up. It was then Shisui's turn to tell a story. Maomao rubbed her eyes. She was feeling lethargic and tired. They had packed more than 10 people into a small room, and everyone was wearing copious perfume. Perhaps they were self-conscious of any body odor. Maomao's keen nose was getting a little tipsy on the aroma. Shisui slid the cloth off her head and held her flame up near her face. She had always looked young for how tall she was. However, her balanced features took on a certain imposing authority in the dancing light. She said, lowering her girlish voice for effect, "This is a story that comes from a country far to the east." Slowly she stopped sounding like a young woman. She began to remind Maomao of a veteran storyteller. In this land there was a famous monk. One day the lord of the neighboring province died. The monk went to perform the funeral. This story is about his journey home. There were 2 mountain ranges the monk had to cross on his way back to his own temple. The journey was impossible to make in a single day, so the monk would need to find lodging for the night. The going had been easy so far. The weather was pleasant, and the distance passed quickly. Finally, the monk decided to stay the night at the temple of a monk he knew. He thought the return journey would be as pleasant as the trip over. However, he was surprised to find his feet felt oddly heavy on the way back. The sun was already sinking. He had covered only 2/3 of the distance he expected to, and he was nowhere near the temple where he planned to spend the night. This monk observed particularly rigorous strictures, so he had no attendants and no horse. He thought to himself, "Looks like I've made a misjudgment." He was on a wide plain full of pampas grass. He could hear wild dogs howling in the distance. If he tried to camp out, they might attack him, so the monk picked up his pace. Soon he came upon an old peasant hovel with a thatched roof. He hurried to the door and knocked. "Pardon me, is anyone home?" A young couple emerged from the hovel. The monk explained his situation and begged them to let him stay the night. He would even sleep in the corner of a storeroom if necessary. "You must be tired from the road." The young wife received the monk most hospitably. She offered him eggplant and cucumber. Although she said they were nothing special, he found them quite delicious. The husband watched the monk with suspicion. Who could blame him with an unknown traveller suddenly arriving at a young couple's home? The monk had few possessions and only a scant amount of money to pay for lodging. The couple treated him as an honoured guest, preparing a place for him to sleep in the next room. Deeply grateful for the soft bed, the monk wondered if there was anything he could do to repay them. He thought the only thing he could do was chant a sutra, so that is what he did, sitting down and intoning a holy text. Normally he was utterly focused while reciting the scriptures, but today he was oddly and acutely aware of the sounds around him. He could hear the wind in the grass. He also heard a noise rather like a bell. Perhaps it was insects. The monk continued to chant, but he listened closely. Then he realized the bell-like sound was a person's voice. "What shall we do, dear?" It was the lady of the house. "Nothing to do." "It is enough." Another bell signaled the husband's voice. The monk thought the sounds were strange, but once he began chanting a sutra, he never stopped until he was finished. Now, dear, that will not do. I do not want to be left alone." The woman was raising her voice. They did not seem to think the monk could hear them, but his ears were better than most people's. He knew it was wrong to eavesdrop and tried to focus on his chanting. Still, he couldn't stop the voices from reaching his ears. "You can think what you want." The wife again, "I am going to do it anyway." Do what exactly? The monk felt a shiver run down his spine. Should he stop chanting and intervene in the argument, or— No, he could not stop chanting. He had to continue reciting the holy text. He wasn't sure why, he just felt it. Yes, why? Why was his whole body trembling? He had goosebumps everywhere, even on the top of his head, which had been shaven bald for a long time. What is this? Come, let's do it. The unsteady sliding door hushed open. It revealed the woman holding a hatchet, and her eyes were wild. The monk shifted his eyes to look at her, but he continued chanting with his mouth. "Where is that monk? Where did he go?" The woman swiped with her hatchet just in front of the monk. Whoosh, but she seemed not to notice him. "Where is he? Did he run away?" The woman left the room, and her shadow stretched out, forming strange shapes. They were inhuman shapes. And then another bizarre shadow joined her. "Search, my love, we must find him, or else the woman was in a panic. Why was she panicking? Otherwise, there was a trying like a bell. Then there came a munching as if someone were chewing up paper. The chewing went on and on. Throughout it all, the monk never stopped chanting the Holy Sutra. The moment the sound stopped, he went outside. He did not say his farewells to the young couple, nor did he look at them. He simply left the house. There he found an insect's brownish wings lying on the ground, trying. He heard the sound of a bug from the pampas grass, and then it faded. The monk brought his hands together in prayer over the tattered insect wing, and then, still chanting, he walked off into the night. Everyone listened raptly to Shisui's story. Maomao considered how important intonation and delivery could be. Usually so airheaded and innocent, Shisui sounded like a completely different person when she was telling her story. She looked different too, with the light of the flame flickering across her face. She almost looks familiar somehow, Maomao thought absently as she regarded Shisui in profile. Then the other girl looked at Maomao and grinned. She extinguished her flame, placing the wick and oil into the brazier in the center of the room. "Okay, you're next," Shisui said, smiling simply once more. Ah yes, Maomao realized if she was attending a scary story gathering, she would eventually have to tell one herself. She nodded. What should I say? Maomao wasn't the type to believe in these kinds of tales, which made it hard for her to come up with anything compelling. Left without any other options, she decided to tell a story she had heard from her old man. She began, "This happened some decades ago. It was said that a small floating flame appeared near a graveyard. This flame was believed to be a wandering human soul. Now that Maomao was the storyteller, Yinghua let go of her. She pulled her cloth around herself until only her eyes were peeking out. Thinking it most peculiar, some brave young people decided to go find out the truth of the matter. And when they did, Maomao could see Yinghua biting her lip. If she was so scared, she should just cover her ears, Maomao thought. They discovered that the explanation was perfectly mundane. A man who lived in the area had been walking among the grave. Someone had just said the light was a restless soul. Unfortunately, the story she was telling wasn't quite the eerie tale everyone had been expecting. Yinghua let out a breath that seemed at once relieved and disappointed. He was just an ordinary grave robber. Yinghua's forehead struck Maomao's shoulder with a whack. Then she looked straight at Maomao and said, "Grave robber?" Yes, he was obsessed with some bizarre curse. He was trying to make a concoction that was supposed to work on all kinds of illnesses. You grind up human livers, then smear them all over your body. Whack. This time Yinghua connected with Maomao's forehead. That's the story, Maomao said, rubbing her head. Yinghua was next, but her story was something less than coherent. Nonetheless, she got through it, and then there was only one light left. The woman who had greeted them was holding it. Now that he thought about it, there was a woman seated at each point of the compass. 2 more were seated between each of them. That made 12 attendees, but this woman had said there were 13 stories. Maomao wondered what was going on here. The last woman told a tale about the time of the former emperor. She spoke of a moment when the number of palace women had grown too large. At that time, only a handful of them were His Majesty's bedfellows. Maomao just couldn't seem to follow what she was saying. Her head was spinning. She gazed vacantly at the brazier before them. The speaker came to some terrifying conclusion. This sent a shiver through everyone else, but Maomao didn't really hear what she was saying. Now, as for the 13th story, their hostess was just about to throw the final light into the brazier when Maomao stood up and opened the window. "Hey, Maomao," Yinghua tried to stop her, but Maomao wasn't about to let her. The wind rushed into the room, blowing everyone's coverings aside. Maomao took a deep breath of the fresh air and let it out again. No wonder I was starting to feel dizzy, she thought. The extinguished lights had all been placed in the brazier. The brazier held charcoal, and the remaining wicks had caught fire again. If you put a lot of half-consumed charcoal fuel in a cramped room and closed the window, only one thing could happen. Maomao went to some of the ladies who looked most slumped around the brazier and moved them to where the airflow was best. Yinghua, realizing what was happening, started to help. Burning a flame in an airless space produces gases that are harmful to the human body. She realized that was why she had felt increasingly sluggish as the night continued. Maomao scolded herself for being slow to notice it, and wondered why she hadn't realized it sooner. She also understood that her behavior had been rather impolite to their host. She turned to the other palace woman to apologize, but she didn't see her. "Bah, and I was so close too," she thought she heard someone say, but there was nobody there. "So what was with that one story?" Shisui asked. The meeting had broken up and everyone was drifting away. Yinghua looked at Maomao as if to ask, "Who is this girl?" Shisui still had her cloth over her head and she seemed happy that way. "What one story?" Maomao asked. Shisui meant the story of the flame in the forest. She hadn't forgotten that Maomao had promised to tell her the story's secret. The prohibition on going into the woods might have been a superstition, but that doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't a good reason behind it. For example, suppose the forest was dangerous. Let us say it was filled with food, but also with things that could not and should not be eaten. That could have inspired the ban. What then? Let us say someone new arrived in the area, someone who had not grown up in the village. Over many years, the warning "you mustn't eat what grows in the forest, for it will harm you" had become simply "don't go into the woods." People had observed this restriction so carefully that nobody knew how to distinguish what was edible and what wasn't in the forest. This suggested that, racked with hunger from the crop shortage, the mother and child tried to sustain themselves on the abundance of the forest. They knew they were violating the village customs, but they did it secretly. They wanted to avoid being seen. They snuck into the forest during twilight. It was a brief time when there was still light, but it was difficult to see anyone. They gathered mushrooms and berries. They returned home as the sun set, not knowing what they had gathered. Maomao said there was a fungus called the moonlight mushroom. It looked very much like the common oyster mushroom. It appeared quite edible, but it was actually poisonous and caused nausea when eaten. As its name suggests, it had one unusual characteristic. Namely, the mushroom glowed after dark. The fruiting body was quite delicious, so delicious in fact that she hadn't been able to help herself from chopping one up and eating a bit of it. Her old man then forced her to vomit it back out, which was one of her most pleasant memories. In any event, the mother and child had gathered the mushrooms before they glowed, so they never knew what they had as they walked along that dark path. The glowing of the mushrooms in their basket might have looked to some distant observer like the floating flames believed to be wandering human souls. Meanwhile, when the woman and her child got home and lit a light, the fungus would cease to shine, looking perfectly normal as they emptied out their harvest and ate it. Moonlight mushrooms were not usually poisonous enough to kill someone, but what if they were eaten by a person who was severely malnourished? The child would die first, and then their mother would follow. There was also the question of what the woman had tried to say at the end. Perhaps she had tried to tell the other villagers, "There are delicious mushrooms in the woods," or something similar. A small act of revenge was directed toward the neighbors who had refused to help her or her child. So that's what it was. Shisui fluttered her cloth, looking satisfied. Then she said, "Okay, I have to go this way," and she went pattering off like a little girl. She seemed like a very free spirit to Maomao, and not especially concerned with other people's opinions. Maomao wasn't one to judge. Her Yinghua said, "So it's not so scary after all." She puffed out her chest bravely, which was very different from how she had acted earlier. "I'll bet the other stories have explanations like that too." Maybe, Maomao said. "I wonder." Together she and Yinghua headed back to the Jade Pavilion. "Oh, you're back earlier than I expected," said Hongyang, who was waiting for them. She was doing some stitching, making little adjustments for the fast-growing princess. "Yeah, things got a little wild at the end," Yinghua said. "I suppose so," Hongyang said, as if this made perfect sense. "After the lady who always hosted those gatherings died last year, I was a little worried about who would take her place." Hongyang set down her needle. She sighed softly and rubbed her shoulders. She was a thoughtful woman. I owed a lot to her kindness myself. I am sorry it was all over for her before she even got out of the rear palace. Maomao studied Yinghua's expression. Her earlier bravado was deserting her, and her face was turning pale. About this lady, this is strictly between us, but she was one of the former emperor's bedmates. I do not much like get-togethers like that, but it was one of her few amusements, and it would have been churlish to stop her. After she passed last year, I have to admit I felt sorry to think of the tradition simply disappearing. I am glad someone stepped up to keep it going. Hongyang put her sewing tools away in a lacquered wooden box, and with another sigh she went to her bedroom. Maomao thought Hongyang's story sounded familiar. Then she realized it resembled the tale the hostess had told. She couldn't remember the exact details, but judging by Yinghua's bloodless expression, she was thinking the same thing. Maomao crossed her arms and puzzled over it. The world was full of things she did not understand. She was glad the convocation had concluded before they became the 13th story. Yinghua, terrified, insisted Maomao stay with her that night. This left Maomao too stifled to get much sleep. Chapter 16, Beating the Heat. Maomao headed for the main room. They said she was wanted for something. When she arrived, she found a eunuch draped across the couch. Maomao bowed politely, then went and stood before Consort Jyokayu. "Lady Jyokayu, you asked for me." "Oh, it wasn't me," Jyokayu said, taking a sip of some warm juice. She usually preferred fruit wine with plenty of ice, but Maomao had told her to avoid it because of her pregnancy. Hongyang was trying to make up for it by fanning her. "I have business with you," Jinchi said, and his face was as gorgeous as ever. Gaeshan was fanning him just as Hongyang was fanning Jyokayu, working industriously. That task would usually be for a less important servant. The fact that no one was present suggested secrets were stirring once more. "What sort of business, sir?" Maomao asked. Jinchi looked at Jyokayu and said, "I would like to have her back for a few days." He was clearly referring to Maomao. She was technically on loan to Consort Jyokayu. She would look after the consort's health until the child was born. One was not normally allowed to return to the rear palace after leaving it. However, special dispensation had been granted, along with special conditions. Goodness. "And what am I supposed to do for a food taster while she is gone?" Jyokayu asked pointedly. "You needn't worry about a thing. I will lend you my lady-in-waiting in the meantime. She is quite experienced with poisons, if not quite so much as this young woman. I wonder, can I trust her? You wound me, lady." Jyokayu had a mischievous smile on her face. When Jinchi spoke of his lady-in-waiting, Maomao thought of only one person, the not-quite elderly Suhin. She would certainly do well enough in Maomao's place. She was shrewd, if nothing else. But if that happened, Maomao wondered who would look after Jinchi. The grandmotherly attendant insisted on babying this otherwise adult man. Maomao wasn't even sure he could dress himself without her help. You said a few days, Jaikai said. Are you planning to go somewhere? Indeed, I have been invited to go hunting. Goodness gracious, hunting, huh? Maomao thought, this is a very high society way to pass the time. Will there be hawks involved to chase down the quarry? Jinchi's smile was perfect. There wasn't even a crack in his facade. Lord Shishu, huh? Maomao thought. She remembered he was an important official, Consort Lulan's father. Was it just Maomao, or did this smell like trouble? She wanted to tell Jinchi not to drag her into anything that would be a huge headache.